Imagine a scenario where the internet isn't, something you just log into.
Right, like a website or an app.
Exactly. Imagine it's something that is physically pulsing through your veins, a reality where the hardware running the global digital network isn't sitting in some massive, heavily air-conditioned server farm in the desert.
But is actually walking around.
Yeah, walking around, grabbing a coffee, completely unaware that humanity itself has been hijacked to become the infrastructure. Today, we are exploring a narrative where that boundary between the living, breathing human being and the digital network has been completely erased. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me. We are pulling from a really specific, pretty intense stack of sources for this one.
We really are.
The material comes to us from a broadcast and commentary series called Echoes from the Edge with the Lone Wolf, and our focus today is entirely on the commentator known as Lone Wolf and their breakdown of this highly explosive interview from a show called Redacted.
Right, and that Redacted interview featured guests Jesse Beltran and Edward Zaul. And we're diving into some highly charged, controversial commentary today. So just to be clear up front for everyone listening, our job here isn't to take sides.
Definitely not.
We're not endorsing these massive claims or validating the scientific arguments presented by these commentators. Our sole mission for this deep dive is to impartially report on the narrative. We're acting as your guides to map out the architecture of this sprawling theory.
So you can see exactly how these ideas are built, what they claim, and how they actually spread.
Because the theory itself argues that humanity is unknowingly being wired into a global cognitive control grid.
Yeah, and the scope of the narrative presented in Echoes from the Edge is it's staggering. It weaves together public health claims, advanced telecommunications infrastructure, and these deep-seated historical anxieties into a single, all-encompassing worldview.
It really requires us to look incredibly closely at the mechanics they propose, just to understand how the entire argument holds together.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we could even begin to understand the ultimate goal of this alleged control grid, we have to look at the physical mechanism.
The delivery system.
Right, the delivery system. Because according to Beltran and Zaul, the foundation of this entire theory hinges on one specific material.
Graphene oxide nanoparticles.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, what exactly is that?
Well, graphene oxide is essentially a microscopic, incredibly conductive layer of carbon. To give you a sense of scale, it is just one atom thick.
One atom. Wow.
Yeah, it's incredibly tiny. And in the real world of material science, it's heavily researched for its unique electrical, thermal, and mechanical properties.
Yeah.
But in the narrative presented on Redacted, these nanoparticles have been weaponized, and they claim they've been deployed on a massive, inescapable scale.
Right, because the sources state that these particles are documented in, quote, certain shots. But Lone Wolf's commentary pushes the deployment far beyond just medical interventions.
They go way further.
They really do. The claim is that this material has now saturated the entire ecosystem. They explicitly list the air, the water, and the food supply.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It is, but this is where I find myself struggling with the physics of their argument a bit.
How so?
Well, we hear about environmental saturation all the time, like microplastics.
Oh, right.
We know microplastics are in the oceans, they're in the rain, they're literally inside our bodies right now.
Yeah, unfortunately.
But microplastics are largely inert. They just sit there. The theory from Beltran and Zaul suggests an involuntary, inescapable exposure for every person to this graphene oxide. But how exactly are these inert particles supposedly functioning once they're actually inside the human body?
Well, what's fascinating here is the specific biological and electromagnetic mechanism the commentators propose to bridge that gap. They are definitely not describing passive debris like microplastics.
Okay, so they're active.
Very active. According to the sources, these graphene oxide nanoparticles are designed to cross the blood-brain barrier.
Wow. And the blood-brain barrier is like the brain's ultimate security system, right?
Exactly. It's a highly selective filter that keeps toxins in the blood from entering the central nervous system. But the claim here is that these nanoscale particles slip past that barrier, they embed themselves in the neural tissue, and they essentially act as miniature biological receivers.
Receivers. Okay, so think of it less like a metal antenna on your roof and more like dropping microscopic iron filings into a cup of water.
That's a great way to picture it.
And then using a magnet on the outside of the glass to manipulate the water's current.
Because the commentators claim these particles are highly conductive, right?
Yes.
And that they're designed to respond to external radio frequency, or RF signals.
And that is the core mechanical claim of the whole theory.
Yeah.
The sources point directly to the invisible web of frequencies that already surrounds us every day. Cell towers, satellites, the existing telecommunications infrastructure.
Stuff we use to check our emails. Exactly. They argue that the external grid is already fully built and it's actively broadcasting. The missing piece of the puzzle, according to this narrative, was getting the receiver inside the human body.
So those external frequencies could manipulate the internal biological state.
You got it. And Lone Wolf is very emphatic that Beltran and Zaul brought the receipts for this. They frame it not as a theory, but as an active rollout, citing scientific studies on RF conductivity and actual patents on this technology.
Right, but if you look at the actual science of magnetogenetics or neuromodulation, researchers are experimenting with these super paramagnetic nanoparticles to do things like targeted drug delivery.
Or localized neurostimulation.
Yeah, but in a lab setting, it really seems like the commentators are taking very real, highly localized experimental lab science and aggressively misinterpreting it as an active global technological rollout.
They are absolutely taking the bleeding edge of real biotechnology and extrapolating it to an apocalyptic extreme. By pointing to actual patents for biointerface technology, it gives them this veneer of established plausibility for their audience.
It makes it sound like a done deal.
Right. They present a narrative that says the government isn't researching this for the future. They have already deployed it in the present.
Which moves us perfectly from the biological infiltration to the technological network itself.
The next phase of the theory.
Because having microscopic receivers embedded in your tissue is only half the equation, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need a network with enough power to actually communicate with billions of those microscopic nodes simultaneously.
And the network architecture is where the theory shifts entirely from biochemical to digital. Lone Wolf heavily amplifies a specific phrase used by Jesse Beltran in the interview.
Oh, the 6G Internet of Bodies.
The 6G Internet of Bodies.
It's a chilling evolution of the Internet of Things. I mean, we all know the Internet of Things.
Sure, your smart fridge, your Wi-Fi thermostat.
Yeah, a doorbell camera. You plug a device in, it connects to the network, and it sends and receives data. But Beltran's concept of, quote, synthetic biology in human form essentially argues that the human body itself has been downgraded to a smart device.
But without a consent form.
Exactly. Like a thermostat that connects to Wi-Fi, but you don't have a screen to show you what data is being uploaded or downloaded.
And the sources specifically focus on 6G infrastructure for a reason. It's because of the sheer bandwidth and zero latency speed you would need for this hypothetical operation.
Right, because 5G wouldn't cut it for 8 billion brains.
Not even close. To map, track, and interact with the neural pathways of billions of people in real time, you would need data capacity that simply doesn't exist on older networks. 6G is theorized to handle terabytes of data per second.
Wow.
So in the redacted narrative, that immense bandwidth isn't for, faster movie downloads on your phone. It is the necessary pipeline for managing a planet-wide biological botnet.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If we assume for a moment that their premise is real, that humanity is wired into a 6G network via these nanoparticles, what is the supposed ultimate goal?
The why?
Yeah, why saturate the environment just to make everyone a walking node on this network?
Well, the darkest pillar of the entire narrative is articulated by Edward Zaul. He claims the ultimate goal is total cognitive influence.
Total cognitive influence.
We are talking about the complete hijacking of the human mind. The theory posits a direct causal link. So a 6G RF signal is broadcast from a tower. It hits the highly conductive graphene oxide embedded in your brain.
Okay.
That particle generates a localized electromagnetic pulse, and that pulse forces a neuron to fire, or it suppresses a specific neurotransmitter.
So they're essentially describing a read-write drive for the human brain.
Precisely. The controllers could theoretically beam a frequency that triggers a massive drop in dopamine to induce depression.
Or spike cortisol to induce panic.
Yes. The controllers own the signal, meaning an individual's thoughts might no longer be entirely their own. The human brain is reduced to a receiver for external inputs.
It's an overwhelming concept, the idea of having your free will biologically overridden. But, the concept of government mind control isn't a new frontier in conspiracy theories.
Or frankly, in history.
Right. And the sources anchor this highly advanced, futuristic 6G nanoparticle theory to a very dark, heavily documented historical precedent. just to give it weight.
Yeah, the terminology they use is impossible to miss. Both Zaul in the interview and Lone Wolf in the commentary repeatedly labeled this entire global operation MKUltra 2.0.
Or MKUltra on steroids.
Exactly.
And for anyone unfamiliar, MKUltra was a very real, highly classified, and entirely illegal CIA program that ran from the early 1950s well into the 1970s.
It was a massive operation.
It was. The agency was terrified that the Soviet Union had cracked the code on mind control, so they launched their own experiments. They experimented on American and Canadian citizens, often without their knowledge or consent.
Using extreme psychological torture.
Sensory deprivation, and most famously, massive doses of LSD.
And it was exposed in congressional hearings in the 1970s, which makes it a matter of public record. It's not a fringe theory.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, invoking MKUltra is a brilliant rhetorical strategy for these commentators.
Why is that?
Because by tying a deeply complex, somewhat invisible theory about RF frequencies and 6G nanoparticles to a documented historical reality of absolute government overreach, it changes how the listener processes the new information.
It provides historical permission to believe the unbelievable.
Exactly. It gives the new theory immediate emotional resonance and plausibility. The logic they are relying on is simple. The government already proved they are willing to experiment on citizens in the shadows to achieve mind control.
They simply upgraded the technology from LSD in a glass of water to graphene oxide in the atmosphere.
Right. It bridges the gap between science fiction and historical precedent.
But the sheer scale shift here is what breaks the logic for me. I mean, they are taking an isolated, covert, historical operation like MKUltra, which, as horrific as it was ultimately a localized lab experiment involving a relatively small pool of subjects.
Right.
And they're claiming it has been flawlessly scaled up into an inescapable, invisible global infrastructure affecting 8 billion people simultaneously.
It's a massive leap.
It is. Without a single whistleblower or structural leak exposing the actual operation, the logistics of coordinating millions of telecom workers, scientists, and government officials to build this specific grid in total secrecy, it just defies reality.
From a logistical standpoint, the scale is an impossibility. But within the ecosystem of commentary broadcasts like echoes from the edge, the vastness of the conspiracy is actually the proof of its power.
How so?
Well, the commentators explain the lack of whistleblowers by arguing that the compartmentalization is absolute. The person building the cell tower thinks they are just upgrading cellular service, right? They are entirely unaware of the biological payload they are supposedly activating. I see.
The sheer size of the operation is what makes it so terrifying to their audience.
And that psychological terror brings us perfectly to the messenger. We've mapped out the alleged technology, the mechanisms of cognitive influence, and the historical MKUltra framing. Now we need to look at how Lone Wolf synthesizes all of this into a philosophical shift and a call to action for their audience.
Right, because a broadcast like this isn't merely, disseminating alternative information. It is actively shaping a worldview.
Lone Wolf uses incredibly urgent, visceral language throughout the commentary, referring to their broadcasts as dropping truth bombs.
And issuing Thursday night howls to the pack.
Yeah, and the core philosophical assertion that Lone Wolf drives home repeatedly is a complete, devastating redefinition of human identity.
There is a specific quote that anchors the whole broadcast. Lone Wolf says, "We are no longer free citizens. We are hardware in their global control grid."
That phrase completely strips away any illusion of individual agency. It tells the listener that the social contract hasn't just been broken.
It's been biologically voided.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean for the person actually tuning in to Echoes from the Edge, listening to this?
Well, it operates on a chilling premise of absolute inevitability. This isn't a warning about a dystopian future that we can, rally against or vote against.
Because the messaging claims the invasion has already succeeded.
Exactly. Lone Wolf explicitly states, they didn't just jab you, they wired you. You are already plugged in.
The invasion is framed as a completed event.
And the psychological impact of that specific rhetoric on the listener is profound. It is designed to challenge their fundamental sense of autonomy. It thrusts them into a state of hypervigilance.
I mean, if you genuinely accept the premise that your environment is completely saturated with mind-altering nanoparticles,
and that a ubiquitous 6G network is actively transmitting signals to rewrite your thoughts,
you are left with a feeling of profound powerlessness. Your own mind is no longer a sanctuary. It sounds paralyzing. If you are already wired as a piece of remote-controlled hardware, then the game is over.
This raises an important question, though. And it highlights a fascinating, massive paradox at the very heart of Lone Wolf's broadcast.
What's the paradox?
They purposefully instill this overwhelming feeling of powerlessness, but they do not leave the listener paralyzed. They immediately pair the terror with an aggressive, urgent directive.
Right.
Lone Wolf tells the pack, expose it, fight it, and rip the grid down before they own every thought.
And there is the glaring contradiction.
Yeah.
The entire narrative of the redacted interview hinges on the claim that humanity is already suffering under total cognitive influence, that the brain is merely a receiver for the controllers.
Right.
Yet Lone Wolf is passionately calling upon the listener's independent thought and individual free will to rise up and destroy the system. I mean, it's a paradoxical call to use your remaining free will to fight the very system that supposedly controls your thoughts.
It is. If the 6G MKUltra 2.0 grid works exactly as Beltran and Zaul claim it does, Lone Wolf wouldn't even have the free will to broadcast the warning.
And the listeners wouldn't be able to comprehend the call to rebellion. The controllers would just beam a signal to make everyone feel perfectly content and docile.
Exactly. It requires severe cognitive dissonance to hold both of those concepts simultaneously, that you're a mind-controlled slave, but also a fully conscious rebel.
But in the realm of extreme commentary, that paradox is the engine of engagement, isn't it?
It absolutely is. The terror of the inescapable grid keeps the listener deeply hooked and vigilant. But the empowering call to action provides a profound sense of purpose.
It tells the listener that they are one of the elite few who can still see the truth, despite the biological hacking. It transforms them from a passive victim into the hero of an invisible, high-stakes global war.
It creates a community bound together by shared secret knowledge and a shared, overwhelming enemy.
Wow, we have covered a tremendous amount of ground today.
I really have.
To summarize the sprawling architecture we've mapped out from Echoes from the Edge with the Lone Wolf and the Redacted interview, the narrative claims that humanity has been involuntarily subjected to a mass deployment of highly conductive graphene oxide nanoparticles through environmental saturation.
And these particles allegedly bypass the blood-brain barrier to act as biological receivers, connecting every individual to a massive, high-bandwidth 6G satellite infrastructure.
The ultimate goal of this Internet of Bodies, according to the sources, is total cognitive influence, a digital, inescapable MKUltra 2.0, where human beings are downgraded to mere hardware.
It is a sweeping theory that attempts to answer very real, modern anxieties about data privacy, bodily autonomy, and algorithmic control by weaving them into a single apocalyptic narrative.
It's a lot to take in, and I want to remind you, our listener, one final time. Today's exploration was entirely an exercise in understanding the anatomy of the claims presented in these specific sources.
Not an endorsement of their factual accuracy.
Exactly. Our goal was to map the architecture of their arguments and understand how they explain their mechanisms.
We've looked at the what, the how, and the why of this specific worldview, but I want to leave you with a broader concept to mull over on your own.
A final provocative thought for the road.
Yeah. Even if we step completely away from this specific narrative, away from the extreme claims of nanoparticle mind control, it forces us to reflect on something very real.
Which is?
The rapidly blurring line between human biology and technology in our real world. Look at the tangible reality of biotechnology right now. We have increasingly advanced medical implants that transmit diagnostic data.
Swear.
We have neural links actively moving into human trials to bridge the brain and the computer. We have wearable technology that constantly monitors our biorhythms, our sleep cycles, our heart rates.
And syncs that deeply intimate biological data directly to corporate cloud servers.
Yeah.
Our biology really is slowly becoming part of the data stream.
Exactly. As these technologies become seamlessly, physically integrated into our daily lives, where will the ultimate boundary actually be between our physical bodies and the digital infrastructure?
That is a great question.
As our environment genuinely does become one giant, interconnected, smart network, what does the future of consent actually look like when the technology you are interacting with is residing inside your own body?
It's a massive, necessary question for the future. When the boundary between the user and the network disappears entirely, who is really holding the remote control?
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you some clarity on how these expansive narratives are built and some serious food for thought about the real-world intersection of technology and humanity. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we will catch you next time.